morning, everyone. Good morning. Just before we get started, just want to cover a couple of things for you. As you may know, that the restrooms are on my right, your left. Okay, will do. Just a couple items. First thing is, turn off your cell phones, please. The second thing is the restrooms are on your left and then to your right and left. So to start this meeting, I would like to welcome Chaplain Cope.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to SpiriTrust Lutheran. We're glad you can be with us today. I wanted to start our meeting today with a few words of scripture and prayer. I'll be reading from 1 Corinthians 12. The body is a unit, though it is made up of many parts, and though all its parts are many, they form one body. So it is with Christ. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. Let's pray. Dear God, we ask that you send your Spirit to be with us today. Give us wisdom throughout this meeting today. We pray that you'd remind us that even though we are many members, we are one body. Each person today in this meeting has their role to play. Each organization, each representative who is here today has their role to play, and they bring their strengths and their backgrounds and their lives to the table today as they work through this meeting. We pray that you would guide us today as we work through this meeting and remind us whatever we face today or in the future, you're always walking with us. All these things we ask in your holy name. Amen.
Next, I'd like to have everybody stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Next, I'd like to invite Carrie Sarfis up to do a couple comments about our community here today.
Tangled up here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carly Sarvis. I'm the Executive Director at the Village at Sprenkle Drive, this wonderful community you're at today. We welcome you and thank you for allowing us to host. Just some brief background about SpiriTrust Lutheran. We were started in 1951 by Sister Charlotte Weisgerber. She was a prominent social worker in Philadelphia, and we started off as Lutheran Social Ministries. And through time, as things evolve, healthcare evolves, needs evolve, we evolved. It became SpiriTrust Lutheran. We have 6 senior living communities in various counties across Pennsylvania, and we also have a home care and hospice side, home and community-based side service. And I just wanted to welcome you here today. Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to invite Susan Martin up for the roll call.
See whether I can do this without turning off the computer. Bethany Village.
Here.
Brethren Village.
Here.
Cornwall Manor.
Here.
Cross Keys Village.
Here.
Foxdale Village. Garden Spot Village.
Here.
Green Ridge Village.
Here.
Homestead Village, Homewood at Plum Creek, Kirkland Village, Landis Homes, Londonderry Village, Luther Acres, Masonic Village, Minnow Haven, Messiah Village, Moravian Manor, Normandy Ridge, Penswood Village, Pleasant View Retirement Community, Quincy, Riverwoods, Souderton Mennonite, SpiriTrust Kelly Drive, SpiriTrust Luther Ridge, SpiriTrust Shrewsbury, SpiriTrust Sprenkle, Stone Ridge, Weir Presbyterian, Woodcrest Village. Thank you. Lowell.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you also for all those of you who have come out today. As soon as I can figure out how to make my computer work, we'll move on. Yeah, they don't make these things easy. When I first got this, all I had to do was click on a little thing that said present, and it came up as presentation. And then somewhere in the process, it changed its mind. So anyhow, we're delighted to have Adam Garcia from Ziegler Finance here today. It's been a topic that a lot of people have been asking about, is how do we understand the finances of our community, particularly since most of us are invested fairly heavily in entrance fees and so forth. So we're excited about this presentation, looking forward to it. Adam joined the senior living team at Ziegler in May of 2014, which he tells me the picture you saw going by, that was from 2014. And life has happened to him since, kids and stuff like that. His principal focus is to serve the needs of senior living and healthcare clients in Mid-Atlantic and Southeastern United States. Prior to joining Ziegler, Adam was Assistant Vice President in the Healthcare Finance Group at BB&T Capital Markets, where he actively participated in $1.4 billion in financing for various communities. I can't even count that high. So, extensive experience in all the stuff he's going to talk about, and he's a graduate of James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where he received a Bachelor of Business Administration in Finance. So, we're challenged on microphones for questions, so please hold your questions to the end. Do we get the other one fixed? Charlie, do you know? Just the lavalier. Okay, so we only have the one mic, and we have somebody who will be bringing that around, but let's wait till the end, and then we'll be able to raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you, because first of all, you can't hear in this room without a mic, and secondly, we're live streaming this to about a dozen people, and they can't hear it if you're not talking into the microphone. So, all right, now please join me in welcoming Adam Garcia to give us his presentation. Thank you, Adam.
I think Lowell just did what most of us want to do with technology when it doesn't work, which is bash it over your knee like Bo Jackson. But thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to present to you guys. I know that the financial operations of a CCRC are very unique and foreign to a lot of people in terms of there's a lot of non-cash items that impact the P&L statement. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll also cover some resources that are available to you guys, some benchmarking medians as it relates to financial performance, and we can provide some of those documents to you if you're interested in seeing them. So to talk a little bit about Ziegler, the firm I work with, we were founded in 1902 in West Bend, Wisconsin. Started out, interestingly, making loans to farmers in rural Wisconsin. And then that evolved into church financing. And the church financing is an important item because through church financing, we have relationships with congregations who are looking to get into CCRCs and senior living. And so, as we were talking about earlier with the evolution of the CCRC business and industry, Ziegler was there with the congregations, a lot of the religiously affiliated organizations who started CCRCs. So we evolved out of that and got into the sector. Ziegler as a firm does about 60% of the financing activity for not-for-profit CCRCs across the country. And you can see here we've got a bunch of offices nationally. This is just a little bit about our volume. As I said, this comprises about 60% of the financing volume in the sector. And what's interesting about that level of financing activity is it gives us a lens into how banks view the sector, how investors view the sector. And what it also did is it enabled us to create some scale. And about 25 years ago, our now CEO recognized that there was a pretty big gap in the sector in that nobody was providing research that was valuable to the executives and boards of CCRCs. And so what we did is we created, we actually have a position where somebody just 100% of their time is devoted to researching trends that impact CCRCs. And through that, we have a bunch of different resources, all of which we can get to you all. And really what it is designed to do is to provide resources to executive teams, boards, residents, whoever wants to utilize them, to better understand the organizations and the challenges and opportunities that our industry is currently facing. So as we look at what's going on out in the world, none of this will be surprising, I'm sure, to anyone in this room. There are a lot of opportunities as we look at senior living across the spectrum. And the main thing that's driving that, as we all know, is the demographics. The baby boomers continuing to flood in and age into a position where senior living facilities and communities may be of interest to them. What we are also seeing is that scale is becoming increasingly important. And we see that in a lot of businesses. Obviously, most of you all were in business or other professions where scale became important. And one of the reasons scale is becoming so important is when you look at some of the headwinds, the expense pressures, the cost of construction, the cost of technology implementation. It's becoming challenging to spread those costs over a smaller unit base and community size. There's continued demand for different types of services, as I'm sure you all have experienced either in a residential setting or a home and community-based services setting. A lot of organizations are looking at opportunities to grow and saying, I've kind of built out my community, or another campus is exceedingly expensive, so what are other ways that we can serve seniors in our market? Technology and innovation is something we're seeing impacting a lot of organizations in the way that we deliver care. The big item that everyone is talking about and continues to talk about in every sector is how artificial intelligence can impact our sector. I was listening to a presentation recently at a conference, and one of the things that they were talking about with how artificial intelligence can be potentially beneficial to CCRCs was, their example was specifically on admissions directly into the skilled nursing facility, where they were studying it and saying, we have to fill out so many different forms to get somebody in with Medicaid or Medicare, and we got to do background checks and all of this other stuff. And it's taking one full day of an employee to admit somebody, and then one full day of an employee to discharge somebody. And if that person's only there for 10 days, that's an insane amount of work. And so where people are seeing, I think, AI come into focus is things like that, where you can have a AI designed device that can go and basically do all of that clerical and administrative work in a quick fashion. The headwinds are also intense, and as I said, scale is what is driving some of these away. Workforce challenges, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. Turnover in the workforce is intense. The cost of labor is intense. I think, I was driving around the other day and the starting wage they were advertising for a Chick-fil-A was $17 an hour. And I think Amazon started it all when they kind of went to $15 an hour, and that kind of set the benchmark for everyone else to catch up, or you're not going to attract labor. Expense pressures, we've seen those hit, as I'm sure everyone has when you go to the grocery store or anywhere else. Insurance premiums are on the rise for property and casualty, and there are a lot of expense pressures that our organizations are facing. For-profit competition, I'm sure that in each of your markets you see a shiny new standalone independent living or assisted living going up all the time. That will continue, and there is a lot of competition from those organizations. And historically, what we had seen, going back 10 and 15 years, was usually that was more, kind of less of an amenity and less of a fit and finish type of design, so more of a Spartan design when focused on for-profit independent living specifically. And we've seen that change where a lot of the for-profits are having amenity-rich organizations and communities similar to the CCRCs we're accustomed to. We'll dive into the uncertainty with skilled nursing. We have a few slides on that, as that's becoming an increasingly challenging business to operate. And then higher interest rates, it's no surprise to anyone here that interest rates have gone up, and with what the CPI numbers are doing, whereas a month or two ago the Fed was talking about 6 to 8 rate cuts, it's now looking like, based on some data I saw this morning, that they're only predicting 2 this year. And so, we're going to be here higher for longer. And all of this is, all of these headwinds and these opportunities, and specifically around scale, is leading to sector consolidation. So in Pennsylvania, the big news that came out on March 29th was that Diacon was selling all of their senior living assets to Lutheran Social Services out of St. Louis. And so they're hard at work on that transaction, and I think it's expected to close here in the next quarter or so. So as we look at the finances of a not-for-profit CCRC, while there is a lot of complexities within some of the GAAP accounting treatment of different items, it's really pretty straightforward. So you have your top line revenue, which is driven by price or monthly service fees, times the volume, which in this instance would be occupancy, and then other ancillary revenues like investment income or those types of things. From that, we need to subtract our key operating expenses: salaries, benefits, dining, overhead, insurance, everything it takes to operate the business. And then I think a majority of the folks in this room are members of entrance fee life plan communities. To that, you then have your entrance fees received in a given year and the cash flow from those, less any refunds paid based upon the contract type. And all of that leads to the cash flow that the organization is generating. And that cash flow needs to be able to cover the debt payments, any capital expenditures or upgrades to the community, future growth or redevelopment initiatives. I think one of the macro trends we saw years ago was a lot of folks basically replacing their skilled nursing facility and going from a more institutional model where there may be semi-private rooms to the household model. And so, when you do something like that, that's not really a revenue accretive opportunity. And so one of the things in driving and building your cash flow is to support future things like that, where you may need to replace something that's just gone to obsolescence. So the 3 main sources of revenue are resident revenue, which is generated from the monthly service fees as well as the entrance fees, charitable contributions, and investment income. Within the context of the resident revenue, there are 3 primary entrance fee contract types. There's a type A, life care contract, which is generally where you pay a higher entrance fee and higher monthly fee while in independent living, but that monthly fee carries with you as you move through the continuum. There's a type B modified life care entrance fee contract. What that contract is you get some discount as you go to higher levels of care, or maybe some free days in a skilled nursing or assisted living complement on campus to the extent you need it. And then a type C fee for service is you pay the entrance fee, and as you move to each level of care, your fee structure changes. If you're in independent living, maybe you're paying $3,000 a month. As you go to assisted, maybe you go to $8,000, and then skilled nursing, obviously a very expensive proposition. So there are some revenues that we can control as an organization and some revenues that we can't. And the two that we really can't control are investment income and charitable contributions. So when we look at investment income, one of the factors that impacts that is going to be our investment policy. We're not going to go out as an organization and invest in pork bellies or Bitcoin or anything like that. The goal of the investment portfolio for our organizations is preservation of capital with modest growth. That's usually what it is. Our executives and board of directors do not want to squander away the resources that you guys have helped them build up. Capital planning is another thing that can impact your investment income. If somebody needs to replace a boiler or replace roofs, you may need to dive into your investment portfolio, which would then impact the income coming thereof. And then you obviously have the market. In 2021, I think the S&P 500 was down 20%. In 2023, it was up 20%. So you are somewhat at the mercy of what the markets are doing and how that all works. As we get to the next one, charitable contributions, obviously this is a challenging one based upon predictability. A lot of times, I'm sure you guys are asked all the time for donations for supporting something, supporting benevolent care, supporting an expansion project. We want to do a new wellness center, naming rights, those types of things. But those are highly unpredictable. Some organizations are fortunate where they have relationships with foundations and receive grants on an annual basis. In Virginia, there's a couple organizations, the Westminster Canterbury organizations, and they somehow years ago tapped into the Letty Whitehead Foundation, which that is a foundation created from shares of Coke stock, and they just get basically a dividend payment every year. The check just comes for a couple $100,000 every year. And so foundations can be really important, but they're generally pretty challenging to find. So now as we look at revenues that we can control, we have monthly service fees. I'm sure that has been a contested and hot button issue for many of you as you've met with your CFOs to talk about rate increases that have likely ratcheted up here over the past few years. Entrance fee increases is another way of creating cash flow. The interesting thing that we're seeing with entrance fees is I think most people are aware that the housing market has been incredibly robust in this country, and we are seeing that entrance fees are not quite keeping up with home values on an increased percentage. And one of the things we always talk about with our executives and boards is the entrance fees that are increasing really don't impact the people in this room or your existing residents, right? You guys have already paid it, you're good to go. So it's really how much can you press the market on entrance fees for future residents, and where that can become valuable is things like replacements. Like I like to think about it a little bit as like your entrance fees are used for capital purposes, right? So the more your entrance fee receipts come in, maybe you can expand amenities, maybe you can add a new outdoor dining venue or something like that. Refundability provisions, there are a mix all the way from 100% refunds of entrance fees down to 0% refunds of entrance fees. Those can be tough to manage, and a lot of organizations offer multiple refund options, and it can be a real big challenge to cash flow if somebody's moving out who has an 80% refund due and the person coming into their unit is a 0% and you have a net cash outflow. So those can be pretty challenging and something that folks need to manage. We look at outside admits. Some organizations can accept outside admits to assisted living and skilled nursing. Others can't. That can be an opportunity, especially for like short-term Medicare rehab stays in the skilled nursing facility. And then leases and ancillary would be things like, can you get a bank branch? Do you want to, do you have some vacant land that you can lease out to somebody, or some excess space where you can create a clinic that's leased out to a physician's practice or something like that. As we look at volume, the keys are unit turnover. Obviously, staying full is very important. The length of time to fill units is also important. One of the challenges we saw during COVID was as people would be vacating units, the cost to flip a unit, replacing cabinets, replacing flooring, drug on based upon the supply chain issues. And so it's really important for organizations to, as quickly as they can, fill a unit, because every day, you can never resell the day or the month that is lost in terms of revenue. It's kind of like a hotel, you know. If I'm selling you, you know, t-shirts, if I don't sell it to you today, I can still sell it to you tomorrow, but in terms of an occupancy-driven model, it's all time-based, and so you can't do that. Moving through the continuum, that's an important thing that's become pretty challenging here recently. With the aging in place phenomenon, people not wanting necessarily to move through the continuum to higher levels of care. And how that can be challenging is it creates kind of a backlog of units that should be available for a new entrance fee or a new occupant or a new resident. And so that has become a challenging thing, I know, from a social aspect for management teams to work through, as they're seeing, you know, the amount of home care being received by independent living residents and saying, this person really should not be living independently, but they're, you know, resisting it, and they're spending a lot of their own money to be able to stay in an independent living unit based on that home care. Waiting list management, we all know the wait lists are important. One of the trends that we've seen that's become increasingly popular is, if you go back, you know, 10 or 15 years, most of the wait lists were, give me $1,000, it's fully refundable, and we'll keep you apprised. What folks were realizing is that their lists were ballooning. They, you know, 1,000 people on the wait list, and it's a number-based system, so we have a unit, so we got to start calling person one and get all the way down. And so what a lot of organizations have done, and I don't know if anyone did this in this room, but is create kind of a ready list as opposed to a wait list, where you pay a much greater deposit, and you basically identify, hey, I want a 2-bedroom apartment, and you have a certain amount of times where that comes up, and if you reject it, then you go back to the regular wait list. So really just trying to get out of all of the wasted time the marketing department has been spending getting to the 220th person who's ready to move. So here's a few data points that I thought would be interesting to this group. Ziegler conducts what we call our CFO hotline. So about once a month, we send out a survey to CFOs across the country, seeking information from them on things like monthly fee increases in this example. And you can see here, we were, you know, plodding along at the 3% right up until COVID, and then in 22 we started to see increases that are higher than that, and I think that's a trend that will continue. One of the things we've also seen, and I don't know if anyone in this room has been subjected to it, but whereas usually we've seen the monthly fee increases be an annual thing, we've started to see some organizations go to a semi-annual increase, whereby they are looking to kind of ease the burden of getting the monthly service fees higher to cover the expense pressures that the organizations are facing. The good news for our sector is occupancy is on the rise at all levels of care. And so the NIC, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but it's a research institution that does a lot of research around senior living trends and occupancy. And you can see here that in the fourth quarter of 2023 compared to 22, we're up pretty significantly across the board, and we're most significantly up in skilled nursing. And part of the increase in the skilled nursing is not necessarily due to the fact that we're doing a good job of occupying beds. Some of that phenomenon is that we're reducing the number of beds available in our skilled nursing facilities, so we're decreasing the denominator. One of the nice things that the not-for-profit sector has always had is a occupancy advantage over our for-profit peers. And so you can see here, this goes all the way back to 2006. Again, NIC is the same source. You can see back then we started off at about 3%. During COVID, at its height, we were at about a 7.5% differential, and now we're at about 3.5%. And so this has been something that's pretty consistently occurred across the board, and I think really speaks to the value of the not-for-profit CCRC as it relates to the value proposition to you all as residents. When we look at operating expenses, this is becoming a very challenging thing for organizations to work through. We know that the healthcare center staffing is incredibly complex. We know that finding enough people to staff is becoming really challenging, which has led a lot of organizations to get into agency usage, which is very expensive. Some organizations have been studying whether or not they can even make money on skilled nursing. And so or break even. We were talking to somebody recently and they were saying they studied their Medicare reimbursement plus agency, and they were losing, money per each individual in their Medicaid skilled nursing bed. And they said, why are we doing this? We'll serve our residents, but we have no reason to pay a bunch of money for somebody else to come in and receive Medicare on our campus, which is challenging because that obviously, kind of goes away from the mission that we're all working towards of serving seniors. Dining and hospitality is becoming expensive. The Amazon phenomenon of the $15 minimum wage, housekeeping and maintenance falls in that same element. And then, we have some service creep, and there was a lot of service creep that we saw coming out of COVID where all of a sudden dining was delivered. So you'd get food delivered to your unit or apartment, and that has continued, and some organizations have not been charging for it. And how do you kind of thread that needle on not upsetting residents, but you've now provided them a service? That service is costing you because your dining room is open, and how do you work through that? From a corporate perspective, obviously labor costs and turnover are a big deal. Marketing costs, how do you develop your wait list? How do you refill your units? General and administrative, just kind of the corporate overhead. Benefit creep, one of the big things that organizations have been studying a lot, and management teams are, what are the benefits are we offering our employees, and do they even want those benefits? So a lot of companies have been talking to their employees and they say, I don't want healthcare, I don't want vision care, I'd rather have greater pay. And so we're seeing a lot of flexible benefits where the employees are able to dictate, well, if I don't get health insurance through you because my spouse has it, well, pay me some more money. And so we're seeing some of those trends. And then obviously the contract type is impactful as it relates to your expense structure, whether you're a type A, B, or C, as we went over earlier. So another thing we looked at when we did that CFO hotline on the monthly service fee increases is why. You can see here that the majority was labor and wages, inflation, food costs, insurance. And I thought it would be interesting to call out some labor metrics. So labor comprises about 30 to 45% of revenues for a CCRC. That goes to 40 to 50% for a healthcare-centric model like assisted living or memory care. And then one of the interesting things that I saw in this data is the average of 1.55 FTEs per resident in a skilled nursing facility or bed. So if you have a 75-bed skilled nursing facility, that's like 120 full-time employees just to serve those residents in skilled nursing. So I think that speaks to the expense of that business and the challenge of that business in the labor market we're in with the turnover that we've seen. So as we get into the skilled nursing trends, and I hit on this a little bit, occupancy continues to rise as we talked about, but the denominator is falling. So 600 nursing homes have closed since the start of the pandemic. There are now 15,000 nursing homes nationwide, so that's reflective of that 600 closures. One of our CFO hotline polls was to ask about nursing to CFOs across the country. And 48% of the responses said they have downsized or are in the process of downsizing their skilled nursing footprint. One other thing, we track all development of new CCRCs across the country, and we've identified that there will be 40 to open over the next 5 years. 30 of those CCRCs will not have a skilled nursing component. And some of that is due to the fact that somebody may already have a skilled nursing complement and they're going 10 miles away and building an independent living satellite campus, and they're going to use their existing skilled nursing capacity on a traditional CCRC campus to serve those residents who need nursing care. But some of them are they're out of it. They're just not interested in dealing with the skilled nursing business. And as you get into that, I mean, you have workforce challenges with the CMS mandates. The reimbursement trends are challenging. As I said, some organizations we've seen have studied it, and they say, with our staffing patterns, we just can't make money serving Medicaid residents. And as much as we'd love to do it, we just can't afford to do it as an organization. Lengths of stay have declined, consumer preference. So it's a really big challenge in the skilled nursing sector. And I think as it relates to you all as residents of I presume everyone in here is a resident of a full continuum CCRC with skilled nursing on the campus. It's really important for your executive team and board to be really studying the skilled nursing because, as we have three, business lines within independent living, assisted living, and skilled nursing, and if skilled nursing is losing a bunch of money, well, it's going to impact everything else within the continuum. Everything is interrelated, and so we need to make sure organizationally that everything is healthy and sustainable for the future. So this is kind of a cheesy graphic, and I'll explain it to you. Lowell, when I said in the presentation, said, I don't really know what that means, and I'll try and explain it to you because it's somewhat thought-provoking, but one of the biggest challenges within the CCRC sector is the cost of facilities and the cost of upgrading dining and keeping everything fresh from a fit and finish standpoint. And so when you study what happens, organizations, and the red line is market defensibility, so that's your attractiveness within the market, and the green line is financial viability. And so a lot of times what we'll see is an organization will need to do some type of a refurbishment project to their community. Maybe they need a new wellness center or new dining venues. And even though they need those and kind of the position of the community is declining a little bit, usually occupancy is really strong. And so from a financial viability standpoint, things continue to go up. The challenge comes once that market defensibility continues to fall, then you run into issues where things like occupancy will begin to fall. And that creates a really challenging problem because once occupancy begins to fall and go to lower levels, it's really challenging to kind of get back to where you were from an organizational standpoint. So the characteristics of sustainable organizations, this is just a few items that we like to call out relative to what organizations are doing or how they would be viewed in the marketplace. Profitability is very important. We often talk about mission over margin or margin over mission with boards. And I think from an organizational standpoint, it's important that we have both. Mission is very important to our nonprofit organizations. It's also important to us keeping our not-for-profit status. But margin is also important. If our organizations and CCRCs aren't making margin, they're not going to be able to serve residents. Cash reserves, as we talked about, very important for growth, redevelopment, and overall just financial sustainability. Located in a good market and being a leader in your market, the Jack Welch be 1 or 2 in your industry. You generally want to be the first or second option for seniors in your marketplace, and that you have a consistency of alignment within what the market is willing to pay for a CCRC and your expense structure to operate that CCRC. Ideally, you don't want to be landlocked. Growth is generally important to our organizations. Growing independent living and serving more seniors can enable us to then add more amenities and make our organizations more attractive. Boards who are strategic and nimble is becoming increasingly important. As I talked about with the affiliation opportunities, I presume most of your executive teams get calls all the time about, do you want to affiliate with us, or boy, if we got an opportunity for you. It's happening, and it's a pretty active marketplace. And so having boards who are aware of that and are able to react quickly to changes in trends is important. And then, as we talked about, the continual reinvestment in the physical plant to keep everything fresh and modern and attractive for the next generation of residents. So I've been asked by a few people about this. These are some great resources when we look at financial performance and what we can do. We're going to dive into a few of the key ratios that we study, but CARF is a publication. We can get that for you. Fitch is a rating agency who dominates the not-for-profit senior living sector. They do a medians report and provide some market commentary on what they're seeing out there. And then Ziegler, as a firm, we have a research group who does research kind of for our investor community. And they cover about 132 not-for-profits, and they provide an annual meeting report with ratios and also some additional commentary on what they're seeing within the organization. All right, so as we look at the ratios that banks and investors and everyone looks at in terms of financial performance. These are the key profitability ratios. And you can see we start off with the net operating margin, so that's basically core resident-related items. So stripping out contributions and philanthropy and investment income, really driving at, are we making money from the resident service fees relative to the resident expenses? And then for not-for-profit CCRCs with an entrance fee, you need to, excuse me, adjust that for the cash received from entrance fees on an annual basis. Operating ratio is a big one. This is really how much does it cost us from an expense structure to make a dollar. The operating margin brings in some non-cash items, which in my opinion somewhat invalidates it, things like amortization and depreciation. And then the total excess margin is just kind of throw everything together and what is it. As we move on to the liquidity and capital structure ratios, the big ratio for liquidity is the days cash on hand. So what that is a measure of, I take my total operating expenses, subtract out of that any non-cash items like depreciation and amortization, and then I divide that into my unrestricted cash and investments. And what it really is a measure of how long can my organization sustain itself without any new cash. Cash to debt was usually an important measure, but is becoming increasingly important as Fitch, the rating agency who primarily covers this sector, has put more of a focus on that ratio as they're providing ratings to the organizations in the sector. And so that is simply just your cash and unrestricted investments relative to your debt. As we go lower, these are the capital structure ratios, debt service coverage ratio, so how much cash am I generating relative to what my debt service payment is. One thing that people will look at sometimes is my debt service coverage ratio revenue only. And what we mean when we say revenue only is it's taking the cash flow generated from the business, but not taking the cash flow generated from my entrance fees. And so a goal for that is to get as close to 1 times as possible. We know that the entrance fees are a huge part of our business, a huge part of the cash flows of our business. And so the debt service coverage revenue only is trying to get at, are we able on a 1-to-1 basis cover the cost of our debt without the need for entrance fees? And then the last one here is average age of plant. And so what this ratio is designed to indicate, and the ratio is pretty simple, it's accumulated depreciation divided by depreciation expense. And so what it is geared towards is signaling whether or not there's going to be the need for a major capital reinvestment in the community. And so the average for a BBB community right now is 13, so that's 13 years. And so what you'll see if you study the ratios of organizations is as organizations start to get into the 15, 18, 20, it's a real signal to investors and banks and management teams that we probably have a pretty significant capital reinvestment that we need to make. So I spoke about the credit ratings earlier, and we won't hit on this a lot, but of the 1,911 CCRCs across the country, roughly 20% of them carry a rating from Fitch or S&P. Moody's does not rate our sector. Fitch is the dominant player, as you can see. They're the purple box. They have 154 credits relative to 18 for S&P. And then you can see the rating distribution by category, primarily a BBB rating, and then you have some below investment grade rated would be that BB, and then very few A-rated organizations. And this is not to say that of that 1,911 more couldn't be rated. There are a lot of organizations who are extremely healthy, who have no debt, or they may have no public debt. So a rating would only be valuable if you're selling public bonds, and we'll get into that here in a second. But if somebody has their entire organization financed with a bank, the rating is of no value. So the 20% is a good metric, but there's probably a higher number of organizations who would qualify for a rating if they saw one. All right, we'll try and move through this pretty quickly to leave some good time for some questions. But as we look at financing, so how do we get in and how do we finance what we need to do as an organization? And so if we're doing a capital project, we are not like a private business where we can say, go to Jim and sell a share to him and he'll get a return on it. We do not have nobody owns us, right? We're a self-sustaining, not-for-profit organization with no owners. And so really our only two sources by which we can fund growth or development is using our cash or investments or using debt. Typically, we see folks using cash for things like non-revenue producing projects. Maybe we're adding a dining venue, or maybe we're doing something within wellness, smaller projects. Maybe we're adding a new chapel or something that's a few $1,000,000 and is not really efficient to go out and seek financing. Programming without bricks and mortar, so maybe we're going to start a home and community-based services organization. We'll fund that with cash, as oftentimes we do with seed capital or growth exploration. So we've seen a trend where folks will go out and buy a 20, 30 acre parcel of land, and they'll use cash to do that, and they'll land bank it with the thought of maybe in the future we'll create a satellite campus or do another type of offering on that. But you can't create land, so if we have an opportunity to buy something that we think is of value, let's get in there and potentially do that. And then we've got down here ineligible items. We'll get into that a little bit, but most of our organizations and most nonprofits fund their debt with tax-exempt debt. The federal government gives us a subsidy so that we can go out and issue debt at a much cheaper cost of capital than a for-profit enterprise for the good that we're doing in the world. But as you can imagine, the federal government is pretty restrictive in what you spend that money on. They don't want us going out and buying jets and helicopters and sending our executives to Turks and Caicos. And so it's very, very limited in terms of what the scope is. But the reality is, by and large, the majority of things we would be doing on a campus are able to be funded with tax-exempt dollars. The few things that aren't are, we've seen organizations who have maybe a parcel of land that's fronting a road, and they say, man, it's not really a good use for independent living because it's so close to a major road. Why don't we build like a strip center and get a Jersey Mike's and a urgent care or something like that? Those would be types of ineligible expenses. So when we look at debt, usually it's capital projects, usually revenue producing projects. So an independent living expansion is very well suited for debt, and the theory there being that you pair the revenues with that expansion project to service the debt you're taking on to do that project. Specific use contributions, and then you can also use taxable debt. So we're working with somebody who's considering they have some land that they don't think is very good for adding senior living on, so they're actually going to develop storage units. So they're going to build a storage unit organization out there, and they're going to finance that with a taxable loan. The three basic types of debt we see out there are tax-exempt, taxable, and alternative. The alternative debt is really governmental programs, which oftentimes are really challenging for a traditional CCRC, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. All right, so the two primary sources that our organizations use to fund growth is public bonds. So those are bonds that are where Ziegler would be an underwriter. They're securities with CUSIPs that are sold to investors. So a lot of the organizations here, you guys have public bonds. You could call your broker and say, hey, I want to buy some Garden Spot Village or Cornwall Manor or whatever. So those are bonds that are publicly traded. They're out there for anyone to buy, and those are the bonds that would oftentimes carry a rating if somebody is so able to do so. Typically, those are sold at a fixed interest rate, so fixed rate of return, 30 or 35-year maturities, so kind of like a mortgage. And they are fully funded at closing, which has become less of an issue, but when short-term interest rates were really low, it was somewhat problematic because our companies and our organizations would be borrowing, say, at 5%, and if you're doing a $50 million project, you get $50 million on day one, you're paying a 5% interest rate on it, but you can't invest that money and earn anything on it because short-term rates were basically zero. And that led to a lot of organizations over the past few years pursuing bank loans. And so a direct bank loan is like you would think a construction loan or anything else. You just go to a bank and they provide you the money. Usually they will offer them in a variable interest rate with an interest rate swap. We won't get into a lot of complexities around the swaps, but those can be a pain point for a lot of organizations. There are some times where people got very cavalier with their swap strategies, and it cost them dearly. We worked on a transaction one time for a borrower in Memphis, Tennessee, and they had to pay $15 million to get out of their swap. That's not fun to do, you know, that is just straight. They issued $15 million of debt to get out of an arrangement. And so the difference with a bank loan is usually banks, while they'll give you up to a 30-year amortization like a mortgage, they say, well, we need intervals where we can get out of the credit, whether it's that we've changed our view or our impression on the sector or your financial performance has declined. So usually banks will only give you, while they'll amortize the loan over 20 or 30 years, they'll have a balloon or a put at every 7 to 15 years. And that 7 to 15 years is usually dependent upon the credit profile of the organization. The stronger the organization, usually the longer a bank is willing to commit to you. The weaker an organization, they want to kind of have that right earlier. So when we get into the governmental programs, won't spend a lot of time on those. Those are usually very narrow in scope. And the challenge that a full continuum CCRC has is by virtue of having all 3 levels of care on the campus, usually within one corporate entity, it makes it incredibly challenging. Like HUD, for example, they'll do skilled nursing all day. They may do some independent living, but you would need to structure your organization so that the land attributable to each of those entities is pledgeable to HUD, and then your other elements would be pledgeable to another organization. So while they can be attractive, and we have seen folks use them to their advantage, usually it's the restrictions to access the programs are usually so narrow that organizations don't want to change their strategic profile to accommodate them. And then also the time. Whereas a normal transaction, you know, from start to finish will take 60 or 90 days. Some of these programs will take 12, 18 months to get financing, and you'll get into government revenue cycles and budget cycles and turnover within administrations, and it just becomes incredibly challenging. REITs were something that people were talking about for a little while, and I'm sure most folks in this room know what REITs are, but in our sector, it's not really of that much value, because in order to be financed by a REIT, you would basically have to sell the community to the REIT and then lease it back. And so with that, you give up an awful lot of control, and we have not seen really any CCRCs want to dive into that. And so when you boil it down, really the 2 primary sources that people look to access are banks and bonds when they're analyzing a project. And usually what we'll do is we'll go out and say, okay, what's the bank market willing to provide you? What does the bond market look like? And run a cost analysis, and is the reward of a bank loan that may have some more risks worth the savings you get from that loan? So here, as you can see, kind of both markets are very... There we go. Thank you. So this is Ziegler's financing volume. You can see the purple bar is our bond issues. That relates to the par amount of debt issued, and then the gray bar is the bank-related issues. And so you can see, you know, in any given year, we're doing about $3 billion in the sector, and about 50 to 80 issues depending on market conditions. So the last thing I'll get into, and I won't get into this in too great a detail, but most of the organizations in this room have their primary legal document is called a master trust indenture. And I wanted to call that out because if you're trying to study kind of what are the limitations on the organization from a growth standpoint, usually that's the core document that you would want to look at. And the uniqueness of a master trust indenture, and it's really kind of unique to not-for-profit financing, is what it enables the organization to do is basically secure loans to multiple different parties at multiple different times with the same security package. So what it does is it brings all of the financial covenants together, and it brings the security together, and then you can issue a debt issuance in 2010 secured by that MTI. Come back, build something else in 2020 and do that. And that's pretty unique in this sector. You know, most private businesses, like if you're a hotelier, every time you issue debt, you issue a new loan with a new bank, or you go about it that way, and it's individually secured by that asset. So that's pretty unique to us. From a security standpoint, most of our organizations have a first mortgage to their, what's going on here? Can you guys see that? Okay.
Yep, it's gone again.
All right, I can't move. I'll have to, contort myself. But the security is usually a first mortgage, so a mortgage on the property, a gross revenue pledge, which is essentially just saying that if the organization runs into difficulty, somebody can step in and continue to collect those revenues while they work a situation out. And then some organizations will have a debt service reserve fund that's just added security from a liquidity standpoint to investors. The key financial covenants that are, I think, important to study if you're interested in diving in is the debt service coverage ratio. Most organizations have a debt service coverage ratio requirement of 1.2 times. The days cash on hand covenant, so that's your primary liquidity test. Usually that's anywhere between 120 and 180 in terms of a covenant level. For organizations that may have higher skilled nursing complements, that oftentimes will be a little bit lower to note that business. Permitted additional indebtedness, that's an important one. The other unique thing about a master trust indenture is, most of the times, and when you're in a business or anything, anytime you want to do something, you need to ask your investors or your bank, hey, I want to grow, will you allow me to do that? One of the nice things about a master trust indenture is there's usually a set of rules and ratios where as long as you meet them, you theoretically could issue $20 billion of debt and none of your existing investors or banks or creditors can say no. So it's a pretty powerful tool for our organizations where we have to continually grow or maybe looking at expansion opportunities. We oftentimes have the control on our side as long as it's a good business proposition and it'll work from an economic standpoint. Usually there's no limitation from your existing creditors on doing that. And then the transfer of assets, that's probably an important one for the folks in this room. Usually your boards and executive teams can't transfer the cash and investments from your organization out somewhere else. So it's kind of twofold in that it protects your financial resources that you've contributed to your community, but it also protects the investors and the banks and just saying, hey, I don't want to get in here and you have $20 million of cash and investments and we close the loan and 2 days later you transfer $10 million to somebody outside of the obligated entity. So that's an important one for you guys to look at as well. All right, so now is some time for questions if folks are so inclined. I know we covered a lot of material in a very short period of time. My contact information is here. If any of those benchmarking resources are of interest to you all, please email me and I'll quickly be able to get those over to you. I think it's in the back. I think that gentleman has the lavalier. Anyone with questions? He's on his way.
Days cash on hand. I read numbers that say 4 years. Fitch seems to be comfortable with less than half of that. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, so I think the Fitch BBB median for days cash on hand is 458 days.
It's a year and a half. Yeah.
So that's what Fitch views as kind of being a quality, stable organization. We see some organizations with thousands of days of cash on hand, and I think it really comes down to somewhat of a balancing act, right? Organizationally, when you're doing a project, do we contribute some of that liquidity to a project as equity? If we got a $50 million project, do we use $10 million of our cash to finance it and go out and finance the other $40 million with debt? One of the unique aspects that we see organizationally is that we have a unique opportunity where we can borrow at a tax-exempt rate, but we can earn taxable rates on our investments and we don't pay taxes on it. And so a lot of times what organizations will do in kind of considering, do I kick equity into a project, is they'll say, okay, well, if the debt I'm issuing is at 5%, can I issue more than 5% on my investment portfolio? And if the answer to that question is yes, then why would I kick in any of my equity to fund a project if I can keep that cash on my balance sheet and basically have a positive arbitrage situation where I'm earning more money on that cash that I would be saving by paying it towards a project?
I live in Bucks County, Pennsylvania.
Yes, sir.
And recently, some of us were looking at CCRCs in Bucks County and Montgomery County, the next door county. There are about 20 not-for-profit CCRCs in those two counties. And we looked up the Form 990s for these 20 CCRCs, and we saw that about 4 of them had negative net assets. That is, their known liabilities exceeded their known assets.
Yep.
So if your mother were considering going into one of the CCRCs with negative net assets, what would you say to her? And what, from your knowledge, beyond Bucks County and Montgomery County, is the industry as a whole in that condition where 20% of the CCRCs have negative net assets?
So the thing I would first study is what is the contract type. A lot of organizations who will have a negative net asset balance will have a highly refundable contract. So they're carrying this gigantic liability on their balance sheet due to residents as they move through the continuum. So the next thing I would study is what is the provisions with which those refunds are paid. If they're paid upon that resident moving out or within a date certain, it would scare me. If they're not paid until a new occupant enters that unit, I don't think I would have as much concern, because you're not going to have kind of a run on the bank or a cash flow issue, which that raises an interesting point. One of the things that's becoming hotly contested, and we're starting to see some groundswells, there was a leading age national call on it yesterday, is legislation around resident refunds. As there's been some organizations through COVID who ran into some financial difficulties, when do refunds get paid? And you've got family members who have been waiting for years to get a refund for their loved one who passed away or moved out. And they're saying, pay me. And the organization is saying, well, I don't have the money to pay you, and also my contract says I don't have to pay you. And so some regulators and state agencies are starting to look at that and saying, is there kind of a healthy medium where, at a certain point you just have to pay the refund? So that is what I would say. And so, usually where we see the high negative net asset values, they would have a highly refundable contract. And depending upon how that contract is structured, it would give me pause for sure.
Thank you. Sir, you said that growth enables additional amenities for retirement communities. And I'm wondering if you have any criteria or data on how growth impacts the ratio of residents to staff. Does it increase or decrease or stay about the same?
So I think it depends on what the kind of growth is. Usually when we say growth can provide amenities, it's individuals looking at providing new independent living. And I think from a staffing standpoint, independent living is pretty light on staff. If you were to add at this community, for example, another 20 cottages, maybe you have to hire one housekeeper, maybe you have to hire another grounds and maintenance individual, but you can very efficiently do independent living. As folks look to do assisted living or skilled nursing, that's obviously a very different proposition from a staffing standpoint. But the key, and what most organizations have done as they've grown over the years, is you do an independent living project coupled with some amenities, and the economics and the profitability and margin generated from independent living can help kind of offset the operating burden of those new amenities.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm from Green Ridge Village, and we are always interested in what's the relationship between the stability of PSL, the parent company, to the campus itself.
Yep. So that's an interesting question, and what we've seen, and why we were talking about scale being so important earlier, and why we see this kind of macro trend towards consolidation, is a lot of times you could have a situation where there's a couple of strong organizations within a subset like you're alluding to, and then maybe a weaker one. So sometimes it can benefit the community by kind of enabling it to grow or get its occupancy up or fix some of its operational challenges. But one of the really nice things, and I don't know if this directly hits your question, but when you kind of bring everything together and you have a multi-site operator, usually that organization has higher debt capacity. So what we've seen a lot of times within multi-site organizations is you may have a project needing to be done at a campus and it's not really revenue producing, and if you were a standalone, you probably wouldn't do it, but because you're part of a system and you have kind of this scale, you'll do it, and you'll sacrifice some of the debt capacity of the parent organization or some other organizations to build on your campus. And then as you grow strength, you may then lend some of your debt capacity to one of your other organizations within the umbrella. So that's what we've seen being helpful, but it's, it is important to look at the individual communities and what the viability is. And the challenge, I think, in doing that oftentimes will be things like how are CEO salaries spread across the communities? How are G&A expenses spread? How is debt spread across the communities? Like, for example, in your instance, if the organization has $100 million of debt, do they say, okay, this community has 30 units, so we're gonna take whatever percentage of units relative to the enterprise and attribute interest expense? So it gets pretty complicated in terms of how you look at it from a combined rolled up situation and as a standalone, but certainly important to look at the health of both.
In a similar vein to the question about negative net worth, a friend of mine asked me to look into several CCRCs in other states that he was considering, and so I looked at their finances, and most of them were running deficits every year, even though they looked beautiful. What should I look for when they're running a deficit?
So the thing that I would look at is the deficit a cash deficit, or is the deficit a non-cash deficit? And as we talked about at the top of the meeting, one of the big things when you look at the financial statements of entrance fee CCRCs is you'll see a big revenue item, amortization of deferred revenue. So that's how the organization from a GAAP standpoint earns your entrance fee over the years. And then you'll see a very large depreciation and amortization item as an expense. We're building these beautiful facilities. GAAP dictates that over a 30-year period, we need to depreciate them down to zero. So I would try and get into the cash generated from the business. The thing that I often like to look at first when analyzing the viability of an organization is the income available for debt service. So what the income available for debt service does, and that's the kind of numerator for your debt service coverage ratio, is it takes out all of the non-cash items and adds in the entrance fees received from the turnover. And where that can be impactful is, we've seen organizations who it's their business model that from a revenue and expense standpoint, they operate at a loss. But then when you factor in their entrance fees, they have a great return. So their business model is predicated upon 20 or 30 new entrance fees a year, and that cash flow is how they set their pricing and expense structure. So I think factoring in those turnover entrance fees and stripping out that cash, the non-cash items, is really important to study that.
Adam, great presentation. And you started touching on this, the SG&A as a percentage of revenue. And as organizations affiliate or merge with other organizations, how was that SG&A tracked over the other organization? So as a percentage of revenue, you were showing rate increases 4.5%, 5%. And it appears that sometimes the SG&A keeps on growing while the revenue doesn't grow.
Yeah, and that is a challenge. I mean, that is a big challenge that the sector is facing. And one of the things that I will share, and I think it's a positive thing that we're nonprofits and it's mission focused, is you may be surprised how painstaking your CEOs and boards stew over monthly fee increases. It pains them. I mean, they're looking at all of this stuff. You know, you're looking at organizations whose operating expenses have gone up 15% year over year based on food costs, based on insurance, based on labor costs. And they're not necessarily passing that on to you at those levels of fee increases we saw, and so it's a challenge. And you know, a good example of that is we have a client in Charleston, South Carolina. Their property and casualty insurance, because they're by water, went up $1.5 million this year. And we said, well, are you going to factor that into your monthly fee increases? And they said, no, we're not. And our response to them was, well, your residents, if they were living in a home, would have faced the exact same fee increases. You know, at what point do we as an organization, in terms of looking at the fiduciary responsibility of caring for residents and having a sustainable organization, at what point do we stop taking the punch on behalf of residents? And so it's certainly a challenging thing that organizations face. And you know, in that instance, that was just we had already done our monthly fee increases. We then go to get our renewal. It's $1.5 million more, and they said, we're not updating our monthly fee increases. We'll eat it and we'll study it again next year. So there are a lot of things like that that are happening behind the scenes. And I think what we're seeing is hesitancy from boards and management teams to really look at how can they don't want to match, I think, the fee increases relative to the expense structure immediately, because I think they're very conscious of the financial position and situation of the residents. I think we have time for one more question.
Adam, does your firm, or is there anyone doing stress tests on the future prospects for CCRCs?
So there are. So in every instance, when Fitch rates an organization, they're doing stress tests. We conduct them for organizations, and our focus is usually around what is the debt capacity and how does that look over time. And so there are organizations, and you know, we often do stress tests and things like that. So there are. Your accounting firm and your CFO could probably do it as well. And we're certainly able to help if anyone is interested. But you know, from our standpoint, it's really from a debt capacity standpoint. Do you have the debt capacity to continue to grow and evolve? And so that's usually how we look at it. But there are other stress tests you can do. You know, if we inflate, you know, our expenses by 4% from our budget and revenue is only 3%, you know, how long is that sustainable? So there are certainly ways that you can analyze that if interested. Well, thank you all. I really appreciated my time here. I appreciate the thoughtful questions. To leave you with one quote, because I think it's somewhat important, and it kind of gets to what I was just talking about with how your boards and the management teams of the organizations where you live are really passionate about providing you all care and really protective. I would say we've likened it almost to like a parental approach on the monthly fees, as a quote from Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, which is, we're all working together, that's the secret. And I think that's important to realize, that you know, your boards and your management teams are working for you guys and trying to create sustainable organizations that'll be around for another 100 years. And so I'll leave that with you, and thank you again for your time this morning. I really appreciate the invite out here. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam. You saw a lot of interest, and Adam is going to be able to stay for lunch, so you can bug him then if you have other questions. And I can say, having been on the board of Asbury Communities, which is a parent of Bethany Village and some other communities in the room, that I saw firsthand the interest on the part of the management and the board in the welfare of the residents. I saw the former CEO of Asbury in tears because a resident was in the hospital, was discharged, and went downhill, and it turned out that the discharge papers were wrong, or discharge orders. And he was in tears reporting that because it wasn't our fault, but it happened to one of our residents. So that's the kind of commitment you see, I think, particularly in the not-for-profit world. Okay, I did not see Austin come in. Is there anyone here from Leading Age PA? Well, this meeting is going to be shorter than I thought. All right. The next up then is Dan Ziegler, who fortunately does not need a computer. And by the way, the good news out of the silver lining in the cloud is I think I just won the argument with my wife about whether or not I need a new computer to replace the one that's 5 years old. I don't want to go through that again.
Thank you, Lowell. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Adam Garcia, for that wonderful elucidating report of CCRC finances. One of the concerns that we at the National Continuing Care Residents Association have is, in a sense, illustrated by your report, which is that elderly people are making large investments in a very, very complicated financial product that we're really not very well equipped to assess. And a report such as we had this morning brings us a step closer to being able to do that. For the benefit of anyone who might be here for the first time, let me just say that the National Continuing Care Residents Association is a national organization of CCRC residents, mostly not-for-profit CCRC residents, and like PARCR, we seek to address issues which are common to all of us. The first thing I'd just like to say about NACRA is that I will be completing my service as president of NACRA on April 30th. And if you see a cheerful look on my face, you'll know why. I will be succeeded by Luana Pinesco, a very able and wonderful member of our board who has been serving as president-elect and according to our bylaws will succeed me. This will happen on April 30th when we're going to be having our annual meeting. Any of you who are members of NACRA, of course, will receive a link in your email to attend the annual meeting, which will be a virtual annual meeting, so there'll be no travel involved. And please watch your email for the time and for the link. It'll be on April 30th, sometime around midday, out of deference for the people in the organization who are living in California and who therefore can't really deal with a meeting earlier than noon our time. Also, those of you who are members should have in your email a ballot for the new board members of NACRA. I hope you'll look at that carefully and submit your votes. The life care contracts that we've been talking about are kind of long-term contracts that we enter into with our CCRC. The length of these contracts varies from individual to individual. Some of us may be in our CCRC for 3 years. I have a neighbor who recently died at age 107, Ella Schapp, and her long-term contract lasted for over 30 years. So these long-term contracts have different lengths of time. The interesting thing about these contracts, as Adam Garcia has shown us, is that as residents, we pay significant fees up front at the beginning of the term of the contract in the form of entry fees, and then through the life of the contract with monthly fees which exceed the cost of the services that were provided on a day-to-day basis. So at the same time that the provider gives us the high-cost services at the end of the contract period. So the skilled nursing and the assisted living and the memory care tend to come at the end of the contract period, whereas our fees, our large fees, come at the beginning. So the work that our management and that Ziegler Bank tries to do is to be sure that the money that we give at the beginning lasts through the period of the contract so that it's available at the end to give us the high care services. So this is not easy to do, and we haven't mentioned it this morning, but one of the key strategies for being sure that both the facilities are maintained in a useful and up-to-date condition and the money is available for the high-end services we get at the end of the contract period are actuarial studies. And the actuarial studies which our organizations perform, while nothing is foolproof in terms of predicting the future, the actuarial studies are kind of the gold standard to be sure that the operations are soundly carried out. The interesting fact is that although the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging has advocated for transparency in CCRC finances so that the wisdom of the buyers will sort of weed out the poorly performing entities, that's the philosophy of the United States Senate Committee, it's very rare that actuarial studies are made available to residents, so that although the advocated transparency is the principle, the carrying out of the principle doesn't work too well if the actuarial reports are withheld from us, the residents. I have looked at one of the actuarial reports for my CCRC, Pennswood Village, because a friend of mine is a bond buyer on the West Coast, and when I complained to him about not being able to see the actuarial report for Pennswood Village, he sent a copy to me. So there I had it. And what I found is that the appendices of this actuarial report were mind-boggling. I mean, there were tables and tables and tables of incomprehensible statistics. However, the narrative part, the beginning, was in plain English and was very easy to understand. And what I also noticed is that when you read it, it became clear that the assumptions on which the report was based are very important to assessing the validity of the conclusions. That is, assumptions are made about future occupancy rate, assumptions are made about future inflation. You have to see if the assumptions make sense in order to know if the conclusions make sense. So while some organizations are now sharing the conclusions of their actuarial reports with residents, it is important that you also see the assumptions, the beginning of the report. And as I said, the report itself is fairly easy to read, although the appendices are not. Well, let me conclude by saying I hope that those of you who are not members of NACRA will join. Like other not-for-profit organizations to which you do belong, NACRA seeks to overcome residents' isolation from each other with respect to those grand national issues which affect our lives as CCRC residents, particularly in matters of our community's long-term fiscal solvency and with respect to our community's responsiveness to residents' needs, aspirations, and desires. One of the things about the report this morning that struck me is that at Pennswood Village, when we were discussing our vision for the future of Pennswood Village, our residents, by and large, like the fact that Pennswood Village is small. And we like the fact that Pennswood Village is a standalone. And so one of the aspirations we had for the strategic plan of the future is that we remain small and that we remain a standalone because we feel there's more intimacy, less complexity in managing it. So what I will bring back to Pennswood Village is Adam Garcia's observation that the trend in the industry is definitely toward consolidation and toward increase in scale. That'll be some bad news I can bring back. Now, like other not-for-profit organizations, NACRA depends on our capacity as human beings to engage in practical reasoning, the pursuit of truth, and the willingness to empathize with the feelings and concerns of others. The CCRC movement is scarcely 70 years old, so we are part of a great experiment in America's national life. NACRA invites you to join with others in seeking creative evolution and perfectibility of this effort, and to share the risks and joys of the aging process. Thank you very much, and please continue to support the National Continuing Care Residents Association.
Well, we're running early, but the folks are setting up lunch back there, so it'll be ready pretty soon. I do have a couple of closing remarks. This one's taken on a whole new meaning. This is my last meeting as the president, which is probably a good thing given the computer problems that I had. I said we'll still be on the board, still involved, but we have opened up nominations. We have a significant amount. We have some turnover. I will be leaving as president, so the nominations are open. The election will be at our board meeting in June, but nominations are open for president. I've nominated the current vice president, Bob Newell, who I think will be an outstanding president. That then leaves the vice president position open. At this point, we have no nominations for the vice president. And 4 years ago, I was asked to be the vice president. And they assured me that there were no duties involved other than backing up the president. I will tell you now, they've lied. So anyhow, we do need a vice president. And after 4 years of service as our treasurer, Terry DiGrutolo has decided to step down from the treasurer position in the board. So we need a new treasurer. We do have a nomination, which is Dale Meadowcroft from Bethany Village. Dale is our webmaster, so he's seen a lot of what PARCR is and does. He was for 8 years the treasurer at Bethany Village for the for the Residents Council. And the only reason he's not still the treasurer is because he was elected president of the Residents Council. So we have 2 candidates, but this is not a coronation, it's an electoral process. We're also Susan DiGrutolo has stepped down from the board along with her husband. So that opens up a position, plus Bill Hunter passed away in January. So that opened up a total of 4, but we have 1 nomination from Dale is not currently a board member, so that'll fill 1 of the slots. And that's what happens when you get old and you can't remember anything. John Burke's wife, it's Elizabeth, right?
Barbara.
I'm sorry?
Barbara.
I wasn't even close, was I? Yeah, that's a good thing I'm getting off the board, or off the president. Can't handle the pressure. So anyhow, we have 2 remaining positions, board positions that we need nominations for. And also Charlie Sproul, who has spent the last 2 years as the meeting coordinator, doing a wonderful job. He's created a document that's now posted on our website that gives you all the information about what's required. So for people who are thinking about doing it, that information is on the parcr.org under the About Us tab. And not to be intimidating, but it's I don't want to. Oh, we got music. Great. I like that. I like that. I won't be so cavalier as to say it's like having a wedding every quarter, but it's close. We don't have to worry about flowers and invitations and stuff like that, but there's still a lot that goes into it. And Charlie's done a great job, so we'll miss him. And also, Charlie, raise your hand, wave. Thank you. Actually, the reason I wanted you to know who Charlie was is because when you get close to him at lunch, you should bow down. Charlie has been named to the Carbon County Hall of Fame for his football skills, which also got him a full ride to college. And I couldn't even make the intramural team, so I'm in awe. Great job, Charlie. Tomorrow, we'll have hopefully tomorrow, if the computer works, we'll have the surveys going out that we do after every meeting, and there will be some additional questions on this one about the online registration and payment process for the meetings. It's still got, it's a pilot project. There's still some flaws and things that we need to try and get fixed. We'd also like to extend that to the membership process. So we're working towards that. But I want a number of questions about that. Did people like it, hate it, make it go away, whatever. Our next meeting is on July 10th this summer at Quincy Village, which we actually hosted PARCR back pre-pandemic. It's a beautiful location out in the countryside, and I think everybody will enjoy being there. The speaker, Adam mentioned artificial intelligence. The speaker is in the PARCR Post, but Nick Patel is the CEO of, whatever his company's called, I can't remember now either. But Thrive, yeah. It's a for-profit subsidiary of Asbury Communities, and Bob Newell and I did a Zoom conference with him, and he's got not just artificial intelligence, all kinds of technologies that are coming out to support senior living and the trade-offs, because the more security you have, the less privacy you have, and so how do you match all that stuff up? So I think it'll be a pretty fascinating conversation. For October, I'm trying to get a speaker in that I heard recently, Brian Roche from Channel 8 did a presentation at Bethany Village on fraud and scams that affect seniors. And I just saw another one recently. Somebody lost $500,000 to a real estate scheme. That you have to go through a nomination process. You can't just call them up and say, hey, Brian, can you come? So I've submitted the forms for that. I have not heard back. I'm also talking to an attorney who's a certified elder care attorney to see if he would be willing to come and talk to us. And we're also working on getting somebody from the Department of Insurance. The person that we talked about in January when Catherine was there, she is leaving the post. There's a new Karen down at the Department of Insurance, and we're hoping to get her to come probably for the January meeting. And there's something called the Elder Law Institute, which holds a basically continuing education program every July, and Catherine is chairing a panel on everything CCRC, and Bob Newell will be representing PARCR on that to talk about what he sees from the resident side. So we'll be probably the only residents in the room, or he will, but that gives us some more visibility and an opportunity to have an impact. So unless anybody has any more questions of me, I am going to try and resurrect the laptop, and I will know before lunch is over, because that's what I'm going to do first, and because I'm supposed to have a presentation after this meeting, or after lunch, so we'll see. And Adam, how long can you stay?
What time? Whatever.
Okay, because I can use my phone to email the presentation to Adam, and we'll use his laptop if we have to, if it'll work, assuming all that works. So, all right, so now I think lunch is ready. I don't see anybody moving back there. So it's time to eat. Enjoy your lunch. And we're supposed to have lunch for 45 minutes, which would take us to 1 o'clock. So we'll plan to reconvene at 1 o'clock for the tours. and and my presentation if it happens. And by the way, Autumn's slides will be posted on our website, as will mine be, and this meeting was recorded up till now, and that recording will be on the website. And for those of you who are visiting by live stream, that portion of the show or the program is concluded. So, all right, thank you. Enjoy lunch.